All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Mittal, and this is FTC Rookie Rescue. We are FTC Team 14481 Don't Blink, and today we're going to be talking all about intake mechanisms. So we're going to get started with a 5 to 10 minute presentation, and then we'll open the floor up to any questions that you guys have on intake mechanisms. And then later on in the meeting, we can branch out to other things about your specific robot or anything that you guys would like to ask, to be honest. So let's dive right in. So what actually is an intake? There are many different types of intakes, and teams have made lots of different things to intake different types of game elements. And as you'll know, in each different year, there are different things that we have to pick up. So during Freight Frenzy, there was freight, which were these little cubes and these little spheres. Last year, during Center Stage, we had to pick up these hexagonal pieces called pixels, which you can see in the left side of the screen. We had to pick up cones in power play. And then this year, we have to pick up these things called samples, which are really annoying, to be honest. But as you can see, there's lots of different shapes and lots of different game elements that we have to pick up and then take to our robot and then take somewhere else. This year, we have to deposit into the bucket. So an intake is anything that gives your robot the ability to pick that game element up. So as you can see over here, the pixels are inside of our robot. We have taken them from the floor into our robot and then primed them for transferring and then outtaking, right? Here we can see a passive intake, a claw. This is, I think, gluten-free. This is an intake prototype, and we'll get into why you need to prototype a little bit later, but this is just a simple version of something that we might make in the future. So that's what an intake is. Now let's get into what the types of intakes are, or at least the common ones, right? There's active intake, which we'll talk about later, but it's usually faster than a passive intake. There are top rollers, which is this tubing kind of on top. There are bottom rollers. So you need a bottom roller sometimes to lift the game element up from the floor when it's not properly going into your mechanism. You can see that here actually. We have this little shaft at the bottom, which housed a bottom roller, which allowed us to actually pick up the pixels from the ground and properly put them inside of our intake. We have tubing. So a top roller is basically just the shaft on top, and you have the ability to put anything you want there, right? You can put tubing, you can put gecko wheels, you could put even just like a little bit of grip tape, right? There's lots of different things that you could put just so that you can bring things inwards. Compliant wheels, yeah, gecko wheels. You'll see those in this robot in the corner. And then there's vectors or horizontal wheels. So far we've talked about intakes that are pulling in your mechanisms like this. And then we've also talked about the intake part of it that goes on the bottom, where it's going in the opposite direction and picking your pieces up from the floor. So the game elements slide and then hit that and then go upwards. Those two are often paired together. And then finally, we have vectors or horizontal wheels, which we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, where basically you'll have wheels spinning inwards like this to maybe pick up big Lego pieces, or even this year, you could use them to pick up the samples. The other type of intake are passive intakes, which is a claw. And the different thing about the claw is that you'll use it in scenarios where you have to usually pick up like an awkward piece shape or game element shape. So you can use any type of intake for any type of game element, but you'll see that in every year, people create different types of intakes for different game elements. So last year, when we had to pick up pixels or the hexagonal pieces, there were people that used active intakes, which is what we did. But then there were other teams that had a claw to pick both of them up. So you'll see different teams do different things, and you can be innovative with the way that you actually create your intakes, and you can do lots of different things. But what we'll usually say is that you want to try and create an active intake because it's just so much faster. But passive intakes and claws are really helpful for picking up those oddly shaped pieces. So for example, cones, or even this year's game where many people are creating intakes or passive intakes. The samples are really awkwardly shaped. So lots of teams are using claws to pick them up. And then finally, there's active and passive, which is kind of like just branching out into like a field that's like not really specific, right? There are lots of different things you can do in FTC. You can create any different type of mechanism you want to. So an active and passive intake where you have like an active claw would be something where you're able to pivot in and out like this. And then at the end, you have maybe a gecko wheel that's basically spinning things in. It's kind of similar to this little prototype in the top right, where you can see these are able to pivot, but they're also spinning inwards. So that's just one example of what an active and passive intake might look like. Now let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of an active intake, right? We always suggest making an active intake over a passive intake because it's just so much faster. But there are some games where you just have to stick to one or the other, right? Or like, or where your team is able to build something that can stick to one or the other, because you'll see teams all over the world creating an active intake for a game that you thought it wasn't even possible, right? So active intakes are also really helpful because they create a larger range. So you'll see over time and through this presentation that claws oftentimes have only some amount of range, right? You're only able to pick up like this, so you don't have as much margin of error. With an active intake, if you build it correctly and you have a geometry that works for that specific game element, you can oftentimes be way far away from your game element when you're actually intaking, and it will still end up in your transfer state and it will still end up in your robot. So yeah, exactly. Less precision is needed. And also it's easier to use with multiple game elements. So when we say this, we mean in center stage when we had to pick up 2 pixels, right? Imagine how difficult it would have been to pick up 2 pixels at the same time. Many teams did it, but it ended up being like we would think a little bit slower. But and honestly, it needed more precision. So you have to think about these things and see, okay, what do I need the most? Do I need precision? Do I need um do I want it to be faster? Do I want less margin of error? Does it matter if it's faster? Right? So there are things like this. Disadvantages, yeah, as I said, active intakes are really awkward to use with a oddly shaped game pieces. So it was pretty hard to use active intakes with the cones in power play, which I guess we can show you later on in this presentation. But um, many teams actually did create an active and passive intake, which basically entailed a claw on top and then rotating tubing on the bottom to make their intake faster, right? So it can be a lot more complex than building a claw, and you'll see that if you're using COTS parts. But honestly, in the end game, I think active intakes are worth the little bit, like the smallest bit of added complexity. So I would just make sure to like weigh out your options, right? Using an active intake will usually take up one more motor. Some teams are doing active intakes without an extra motor, but we always suggest using one because it's just more consistent in terms of like how much power you're getting and like the mounting for it and even like how your center of gravity works out. We just think using one more motor is usually helpful. And then it's less consistent. So I think less consistent is like it really depends on how you make your intake because you can make anything as consistent as it can be based on how much you prototype, how you work out the geometry. If you include a bottom roller rather than not, right? For some game elements, you need one. For some game elements, you don't. So I think it really comes down to how you make it. A passive intake, the passive intake advantages and disadvantages. Okay, yeah. So as we said before, an active intake is a little bit more complex. Passive intakes are a lot simpler. They're usually faster to construct. You have fewer moving parts, which means like it won't fail as often. Um, because it's like a claw that goes in and out like this, you don't necessarily need you don't need another motor, right? You can just use a servo to do that motion. And then you're also able to pick up those oddly shaped pieces that you might not be able to with an active intake. What's cool is actually the Enforcer is a team from NJ. I wonder if any of them are in the meeting today. If you are, please shout out. But if you're not, the enforcers actually had an active intake for the cones, which everyone thought was not doable. But it was really cool. They went to Worlds. They did a really great job. Their active intake was super fast and it worked really well. Um, Claws can oftentimes be slower. The driver has to angle the robot, position the claw, and grasp the element. Yeah, so that's kind of why it is slower, right? You need a lot more actions. When you're using an active intake, your robot can go directly into the piece and then back out. But when it comes to a claw, the robot has to go, close, and then come back, right? So that's an extra motion that will eventually make it slower. And it might be more precise, but it could take more time, ultimately making you guys less competitive, right? Um, with an intake, the driver only needs to position it and grab the element. Claws tend to be more delicate and can break more easily. Yeah, so in our World Championship season during power play, we had a claw, and actually the night before elims, it had broken down because I think our servo had broken because we had too much impact going into it. So I think the best way to mitigate or like fix this issue is just making sure you build things in a robust manner and you're not like forcing it to do too much stuff or like you're not forcing it into positions that it's not supposed to be in, right? You want to make sure that your claw is just is just pretty robust and is able to work over lots of time and is consistent. And yeah, that's the end of this presentation. So if anyone has any questions regarding their intake, what they want to do this season, if you guys want to even just talk about your intake ideas that you guys have, um, just please feel open. But yeah, you can put them in the chat as well. If I didn't go over anything, could ask. Okay, so Manya sent me a question. So can passive claws be vertical or do they have to be horizontal? Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So just like how I said before, anything in FTC is like you can build anything however you want to do, however you want in FTC. So if you wanted a claw that goes from the top, you can do that. If you want a claw from the, you can do that as well, right? Claws can come in any shape and size, so you don't really have to worry about the orientation that it's in. In fact, we were using a claw for our outtake, and we used a claw for our outtake last year. We had our claw positioned in many different orientations, and we think that you're able to do it in any way. Okay, so another question in the chat. What has your team been experimenting with for the samples? Hey, why are you trying to get our information? No, I'm kidding. In terms of samples, we've been we obviously really want to do an active intake, and I think that's what we're opting for currently. But in the season, if things don't work out the way we want to, then we're definitely gonna see what we can do and maybe switch from there. But currently, we're thinking like an active intake picking it up from the sides or maybe the top. We don't really know. But yeah. So another question in the chat. What is the difference between the top rollers and bottom rollers? Okay, yeah, this is a great question. And I can give you guys an example right now.
I just had to join. I don't have to do anything. I'm not even paying attention.
Okay. Okay. Let me find a example. Um okay, yeah, cool. I have a good example I can show you guys. But if I had to give you like a really quick answer while my thing loads, wow, maybe this isn't a good example. Okay, so an active intake or a bottom roller and a top roller basically entail a shaft on the top and a shaft on the bottom. The shaft on the top has the ability to have either probably gecko wheels or tubing. Tubing is basically like this flimsy thing that you can put in rows. And then once you latch it onto your intake shaft or the top shaft, it basically spins like this and it pulls the pieces in. And the reason why tubing is oftentimes better than gecko wheels is because it offers it offers the ability to go in between like the gaps in the pieces and it pulls things in a lot quicker. A bottom roller is on the bottom of your intake and it's actually spinning in the opposite direction. So if you think about how that's actually working, this one is pulling them in like this, and this one is kicking them up and then into your intake like this. And the reason why that's beneficial is because some elements will slide will slide on the mats rather than rolling. So when the game elements are sliding when you're intaking them, then you know you basically 100% need need a bottom roller. But let's say the game elements are rolling. For the most part, you're not going to need a bottom roller. Did that answer your question? I can. Okay, cool. So I'm not going to read who it was because this was a direct message, but honestly, you guys can put them in the chat regularly. But okay, our team was thinking of using a sliding mechanism to actually reach into the submersible and have a pivot in between the two slides to reach up and transfer the sample to the back of the robot for outtaking. We were planning on using a claw instead of rollers for both the intake and outtake. How would you advise to move forward with the idea? Okay, so just so that everybody understands the scenario, we have a claw going into the submersible, pivoting, picking up the sample, pivoting back up probably, coming back into the robot, and then pivoting up, and then your outtake is like here, right? And he wants to have an outtake for his intake. He wants to have an outtake for his intake and outtake. Okay, so did I get that right? Um, to the person that messaged me? Oh yeah, pretty much. All right. So are you intaking from the back of the blocks? Like how does your intake go in? Does it pick up from the top or is it picking up from the back of it? Back of the samples? How's it working? From the top of the sample. Okay, so you're picking up like this, right? So what you could do is, and you're saying you have an arm on your outtake as well? Do you have an arm on your outtake as well? It's a DR4B for outtaking. Okay, so what I suggest is usually what teams will do is at the end of their DR4B or at the end of their outtaking slash maybe slides mechanism or vertical extension, right? It's usually recommended that you have another pivoting arm that is being powered by servos that are mounted on top of that vertical extension or somewhere on that vertical extension so that you can pick up from your intake and then go to your outtake. So let's say you're picking up from the block. What I would suggest is once you pick it up, you come back, you rotate up, right? And then uh maybe you can have like a claw that picks something up like this. Like your outtake, it's connected to your outtake arm, which is on top of your DR4B, which basically picks up like this, right? What I would say though is that that won't always be super accurate because or at least consistent because you don't know where your intake is going to pick it up, right? Let's say your intake picks it up here or here. You could have something that has the ability to like vector your intake into the middle of the sample just so that you know that you're always there. And like you could have like angles to ensure that your claw comes to the middle. And then something back and picking up. Sid, I'm sorry. You can DM me on the side if you want some more help with your robot, but just let me know. Okay, so there's another question in the chat. Related to rollers, how would the tubing be attached to the shaft? So, okay, that's a great question. There's lots of resources that you can use. Um, when I was a rookie, what I did was actually drill holes in the tubing, and then I like screwed through the tubing into a sonic hub that GoBuilda sells. And this worked, but there were a couple of flaws, right? The tubing was angled because of how the screw was going in, and then on top of that, um, it took a lot of time to make. So what I would suggest is creating a creating or not creating, but using this open sourced 3D printed yeah like thing, I guess. It's called an optake. And on this optic, you basically slide it on the shaft, and it has three little points. And you can put a tubing piece on each and every point, and then it's like completely straight, and it intakes the mechanisms perfectly. Did that answer your question? Okay, perfect. I got another message from Aditya Pochnapedi. Uh, for this season, would you recommend the usage of a slide or a praying mantis like intake, which will fold into the sample and pick it up? Um, I think this season you can do lots of different things because the the samples are made in a way. Uh, okay, sorry. So for this season, I should recommend using a slide or a praying mantis like intake, which will fold into the sample and pick it up. So when you say praying mantis, do you mean like something that rotates from the inside of your robot to the submersible? Okay, I'll get back to you. There's another question in the chat. Hey, so many teams, hey, so like many teams, I'm trying to do an extendo intake since there's an extension limit this year. I don't think it's necessary to string my extension, so I was wondering if you could explain to me what linkages are and how I can use them on an extendo. So for those of you who don't know, an extendo is a set of slides on hopefully either side of your robot or on both sides of your robot that extend out and have or linear slides that extend out and basically give you more reach and ultimately limit your drive time. So this year there's an extension limit, which is 42 by 20 inches. So your intake or your extendo slash linear slides that are going out only have the ability to, yeah, I can share my screen and show you what a linkage looks like. Um, just 1 second, let me. Okay, so this is our Power Play season robot. I'll show you it once. Um, so it is currently very broken. Uh, lots of things haven't been fixed in this CAD after so much time of like messing around with it. But here's what an extendo and a linkage would look like. These are the slides on the sides that go out, and then this is a linkage. And I wonder if this works. Okay, wait. Let me just. Okay, whatever. So these slides go out because this linkage is pushing it forward. The linkage has the ability to rotate at this point and is rotating here, and there's rotation here. So this linkage, it's out like this right now, but then it folds in like this. Folds out and folds in. And basically the linkage is connected here and pulls in the slides and then pulls them out to give the robot more reach and length. And it gives you the ability to reach over the submersible maybe, and then um, drop down your intake. That's similar to what we're doing this year. This year we have a linkage that pushes out our slides and then our intake drops down, right? So basically you want to make sure that your linkage has the correct amount of torque at different parts of your position. So when you're in the robot, you want to get your linkage as close to that 180-degree mark as you can, but not exactly at 180. And then when you're out, you want to make your linkage the perfect length so that once the slides are fully out, the linkage is like this, or like almost 180 degrees again. The reason for that is that once a linkage is fully parallel, it doesn't go in, right? If I wanted to push this in, it would take so much force for me to finally bring this back. So you want to ensure that when your linkage or when your slides are fully extended, your linkage looks like this. And then when it's back, it looks something like this or like something close to that. Did that answer your question? Okay, sounds good. I also suggest that you watch the YouTube video that we have posted in our Discord server and on our YouTube channel regarding linkages, which was actually our first or maybe second. Oh no, we talked a little bit more about slides and extendos in our first session. So I would suggest you hop back to that one. A two-part system where the base. So this is going back to. Oh, okay. We have another one. I was wondering if you could send me the open source 3D printed intake you were talking about. Yeah, sure. I can send you guys the Optake link. We'll probably be ending the session in a few minutes, but I can quickly find it. It should be on the FTC Discord server. So you basically just search it up and then you should find Optake. Here, I can send it to you right now. I have it. Optics are basically like something that you slide on a shaft and then you can put tubing on that shaft or put tubing on that part. And then when the shaft turns, the optic turns with it. And then inconsequently, the tubing also turns slowly intaking the mechanisms. Or not slowly, but quickly intaking the mechanism. I posted it in the chat. Oh, sorry about that. Posted it in the chat just now. So hopping back to Ochna Petty's question. So a two-part system. And by the way, guys, please start sending your messages in everyone chat if possible. A two-part system where the base will fold towards the sample, and then there will be another part which will wrap around the sample. I think it'll be helpful if you could maybe DM me after the meeting and I could help you out with that because I'm not quite sure what you mean. But maybe you could send me a photo or two and I could help you work through that. But are there any final questions that anyone has about intakes or anything? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was a great session. This will be posted on YouTube soon tonight. And have a nice night. Bye, everyone.